I know I said I'd be in Chicago, and I will be in a few weeks. Pero estoy en Peru, so I have to talk about the Lima Metro.
I'm very proud for Line 1 because it's very impressive.
We have an area that is already urbanized and already built. It's even more difficult to implement a mass transit mode.
Construction began in 1986 to address the region's horrible traffic, and 7 stations were soon completed. But then there was some corruption, Peru had a bit of a terrorism problem, and inflation hit 7,000%. I'm not kidding about that last one. Given these slightly more pressing issues, those 7 stations were abandoned. But Peru never forgot about the metro.
After 3 failed attempts, Line 1 finally opened to the public in 2012, 22 years after the whole thing had been left for dead. Line 1 was quickly extended, and they're now working on a fully underground Line 2 that'll connect the metro with the BRT network.
This is a metro system that once seemed impossible to build. If this video doesn't give you hope for transit, I don't know what will. If you've ever been to Lima, there's one thing you'll notice very quickly.
So traffic in Peru, in my opinion, is awful.
And this traffic is where our story begins, because it's the whole reason the metro even exists.
The traffic you see in Lima today is a direct result of the migration patterns that have shaped the city. For over a century, generations of Peruvians have moved to Lima in search of economic opportunity, something that Franco here covered extensively in this research paper.
In the beginning, they were settling close to the center, but the second migration waves during the 60s and so on, they went far away from the city center.
These later waves were made up of much poorer migrants fleeing instability and poverty in rural Peru. The only land they could afford was away from the city center, usually on the hills of Lima's periphery. These areas lacked basic services like water or electricity, let alone proper transit infrastructure. But the biggest issue was that most jobs were still in the center of Lima, creating extremely concentrated demand for transport into and out of the city.
Lima's a very congested city because you have a lot of trips going into the same direction, which is the center of the city. And the main problem is that there was not an efficient institutional transport solution.
This created a confusing mess of public buses, private buses, microbuses, taxis, and 7 other things I don't know the name of, all competing with each other and engaging in some very questionable driving.
So it's not very comfortable, it's not very reliable, because you don't have routes or specific timetables, but this is the main transport mode that people use, especially people from middle income, low income.
And all these clips you're seeing, they honestly don't even capture half of the chaos. You really have to visit Lima to see these buses for yourself. This system, unsurprisingly, led to traffic deaths and a lot of air pollution, but it also severely held back Lima's economy.
I remember taking 3 hours, when I work and studied at the same time. And those are 3 hours I couldn't have for study or for finishing my work.
And in case you didn't know, Lima actually built South America's first electrified tram system in 1902, which they later dismantled in favor of cars and buses. Stop me if you've seen this story before. So, in the 1960s, the government began looking for solutions to this traffic. Lima's first mass transit study was produced in 1965, recommending a metro system with 4 underground lines at a cost of $928 million. The plan was eventually scoped down and approved by the Velasco government in 1968. But that's where the problems began.
Velasco ran up massive debt and inflation to the point where he was deposed in a 1975 coup. This instability led to highway construction being prioritized, for a few reasons.
Time management, so within 5 years you can build 1 flyover, 2 flyovers, and then you have this huge infrastructure work that you prove that you did something to the city.
Building a metro system, on the other hand, would take far longer than a 5-year presidential term, so there wasn't much political incentive to do so.
This is also related to corruption cases, so usually these investments are very overpriced. It's a way to receive money under the table.
So it took 10 years before President Alan Garcia finally got the metro started in 1985. But by the late 1980s, Garcia's popularity had faded dramatically. In what's now referred to as Peru's lost decade, the country faced terror campaigns, hyperinflation, and the administration got caught in a corruption scandal that ended with John Kerry, of all people, finding Alan Garcia guilty of arms trafficking. Building a new metro system naturally wasn't a priority, so after 7 stations and 9 kilometers of track were completed, the project was quietly dropped as Garcia was ousted in 1990. In a final twist, the government kept performing maintenance on the infrastructure that was already built, running empty trains and guarding stations from vandalism. But with no concrete plan to complete Line 1 and the country still reeling from the lost decade, the metro was very much left for dead.
So how did Peru bring it back to life?
Throughout the 90s, Peru's economy began to recover, thanks to the questionable legacy of Alberto Fujimori. But traffic in Lima kept getting worse, especially after the bus industry was deregulated, making an already chaotic situation even crazier.
Knowing that the city still had a bunch of metro track lying around, multiple attempts were made to restart the project, but it all kept coming down to one central question. If the metro was actually built, how many people would use it?
This estimate of demand was the key to figuring out the project's funding, which is square one. No funding, no project. Funding is also this channel's favorite topic.
Funding.
And a quick explanation on why demand mattered so much specifically for Line 1's funding. This project was largely completed as a P3, or public-private partnership. Every infrastructure project has 5 elements: D, B, F, O, and M. In the olden days, governments would contract out the design and build to architects and general contractors, then take responsibility for the FOM themselves. This is called traditional procurement. And this works fine if the government can actually handle the FOMing, but that's rarely the case, especially not the effing. Enter the P3. This method divides up the DB, FO, and M between the government and a consortium of private companies, which usually involves architects, construction companies, and banks. The motivation behind doing all of this is to manage risk. For example, if the consortium is responsible for financing, they take on the risk of cost overruns, not the government. Another benefit is that the government might be inexperienced in operating a metro system, so letting the private sector do the O could be better for riders. These were both big motivations for completing Line 1 as a P3.
We wanted to guarantee the quality of the service for the users. Typical procurement, we couldn't guarantee that. We also introduced this possibility that the concessionaire could do some investments in order to reduce the level of subsidies.
Since the consortium often gets paid based on a ridership-dependent metric, like taking a cut of future fare revenues, this means that getting private sector financing relies heavily on coming up with an accurate estimate for that ridership.
Now do you see why everyone was so hung up on that question?
3 major demand studies were carried out from 2003 to 2009, each with an attempt to secure a private sector partner in a P3 agreement. But no private consortium was willing to agree to the terms of the first or the second proposals, which required the private partner to put significant capital into a project that didn't exactly have the best track record. The deadline for the second agreement was even postponed 14 times, but there were still no bids. So by the third time round, the government decided to do things differently. They would finance the design and construction of the metro themselves, then ask the private sector to only handle the operation and service. This meant that by the time the private sector was involved, they could be confident that the metro would actually open, since construction would already be complete, and you probably wouldn't want to abandon it a second time. Here's where Christy comes in. She worked directly on the procurement of Line 1 through her role at ProInversion, the government agency responsible for promoting private investment in Peru. ProInversion was also tasked with selecting the private consortium that would operate and maintain the metro.
We learned a lot with Line 1. Once we demonstrate to the investors that we were capable, we have all the abilities, investors for the next metro lines start to appear.
In my opinion, plenty of transit agencies in North America should pay attention to this effort to keep knowledge in-house. Eric Goldwyn, a professor at NYU's Marin Institute and leader of the Transit Cost Project, puts this succinctly.
With American transit agencies, the people who run capital construction oftentimes have no experience building a light rail, building a subway. It's not necessarily a bad thing for someone like that to work on a project, but at the very top, you do need someone who has done it because those people have seen all the problems, right?
By not keeping sufficient expertise in-house, we easily end up overpaying for new projects and mismanaging existing systems. But back to the Lima Metro. Work began in January 2010, and many were skeptical. But 18 months later, it was somehow ready.
All the information, the studies, the contract was published. Nothing can be under the table, as we say in Peru. We are always under the shadow of corruption.
And in January 2012, 22 years after the whole project had been left for dead, Part 1 of Line 1 of the Lima Metro finally opened to the public. This whole story might seem like a lesson in what not to do, but Lima actually did one thing very well. They kept costs low.
Line 1 was extended in 2014, and the total cost, including the amount spent in the 1980s, came out to around $2 billion for a 34-kilometer line. That's around $60 million per kilometer, in line with international averages for surface projects, and quite a bit lower than costs in the US. This is even more impressive considering that the metro is true rapid transit, not light rail. It was also a major success from a ridership standpoint, the part that most normal people care about. And for what it's worth, I rode it around for a few days and I was impressed. Granted, I only stayed in the middle part of the line because multiple people told me to not go any further. But at least that part was relatively clean, modern, and safe.
Buying that ticket was very difficult. I was trying to put like 20 sols on, but apparently each ride only cost like 1 to 2 sol. So she was like, "Are you sure?" And I was like, "Okay, can I put 10 on?" But I don't know how to say 10 in Spanish.
Line 1 has proved the obvious viability of rapid transit in Lima, and not many people realize this, but the city is now in a race against itself to build out a truly comprehensive transit system. Let me explain. A lot of people in Lima rely on transit today, i.e. buses that look like they're from the 1950s or an active war zone. But put yourself in the shoes of someone who has to make a 2-hour commute every day in these buses. The second you make enough money, you're going to buy a car, because it's a much better experience even with the traffic. And once you buy that car, there's no way you're going to ride the bus anymore. Bus wankers! So if Lima truly wants to fix its traffic and keep cars off the road, it has to improve its transit quicker than the rate at which people can afford cars. It is very much a race against time. To be clear, traffic in Lima is still bad, and Line 1 itself is very far from perfect. So this isn't a typical success story, and some will say that it's not a success at all.
But I think the metro shows us how these seemingly impossible transit projects can still be built, even if they've been abandoned for decades. That's the true power of procurement. And if you're still watching this video, I'm proud of you for making it through what might be the driest topic on the internet. And I have to mention that all of this was only possible thanks to Peru regaining some political and economic stability. Without this foundation, it's impossible to invest in anything for the long run, let alone shiny new metro systems. It's a reminder to those of us who are fortunate enough to live in a place with stable institutions that we can never take it for granted. 3 more things before I end this video. First, thank you for 10,000 subscribers. I had no idea that so many people are interested in transit procurement and funding, but if you guys keep watching these, I'll keep making them. Second, I promise the next video will be about Chicago. I just already had this trip planned and I'm borderline addicted to making these videos. Finally, as always, feel free to leave a comment about any transit system you'd like to see me cover. The list will take me 5 years to clear at this point, but I'll keep writing them down. And that's it for this video. A huge thank you again to Romina, Christy, and Franco for helping out with my research. Peru really has pulled off the impossible with the metro, and hopefully I did it justice. Thanks for watching.